Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. What is the role that the Quran should be playing in our lives? What is the impact that the Quran should be having on us? That is what I want to discuss in today's episode, because today's ummah, I believe, it's severely divided. And it's divided between two groups. There's one group that gets very, very emotionally charged every time it hears the words of the Quran. You will see them crying, you will see them very moved by the words of Allah. And then you have another group which apparently it appears as if they're not emotionally impacted at all. And this causes a divide because then you have two groups of people who are constantly judging each other. Those who are emotionally charged by the Quran, they start to eventually become self-righteous. So they start to have this feeling that we have understood the words of Allah. The words of Allah directly impact our hearts, but they don't have any effect on the other group because the other group are basically hypocrites. Okay, so they're calling themselves Muslims, but because they're not emotionally affected by the Quran, they're not really believers at all. And then when you look at the other group who do not apparently get so emotionally charged by the Quran, they start to judge the first group by saying, okay, the first group are the ones acting as if they are hypocrites. They're putting on this display, this public display, where they want everyone to see them crying because they want everyone to see that they're so affected by the Quran. So you have two groups of people that apparently react in a different way when they hear the verses of the Quran, and both groups seem to be judging each other, and this is causing a divide in the ummah. So it's important for us to understand what is the impact that the Quran should be having. In other words, which group is right, or is it that both groups are actually incorrect? And what makes the situation even worse is that the group which gets emotionally charged, they usually comprise of the older generation. And the group that seems to not have any effect at all, they usually comprise of the younger generation. So this divide is actually causing a divide between the older generation and the younger generation. That's why today in families, we have parents who are judging their kids, and they're very upset that our kids are not Islamic enough. And we have kids who are judging their parents because they believe that their parents are making this public display of Quran and crying and weeping and so on. But, they're actually hypocrites themselves. It's basically affecting our own household unit and the family itself. So to address this issue, let me first explain this from the perspective of those who are in the young generation. I remember several years ago when I started my study of tafsir and I was trying to understand Islam, I was trying to get a grasp of the Quran. It was very alienating for me because every time I would hear a preacher preach about Islam, as I said, you would see them moved so much. There was visibly so much love and emotion and passion in their voice. And then the people listening would be so moved. And it felt weird because I didn't actually feel anything. I mean, I was trying to understand, I was trying to gain knowledge, and I did gain knowledge, but I didn't feel the kind of emotion that the preacher was feeling. At the same time, you have people who talk about prayer and the fact that the prayer is supposed to have this huge effect on you and it's supposed to completely change you. And every salah should be a prayer that has a profound impact on your personality. But my prayer wasn't doing that. So I was praying 5 times a day, but I didn't feel like I was a different person. I didn't feel any more connected to Allah than I was before. And I also remember that, when I shifted to Pakistan, the concept of having dars in Pakistan is actually very, very common. It's not so common abroad, but it's very common in Pakistan. And, every time I was taken by my mother to a dars, it was very interesting because somebody would be teaching. I would be gaining a lot of knowledge. But then, towards the end of the dars, you look around and everyone's crying. And everyone is so emotionally touched, especially when it's time for the dua. Everyone is like crying and weeping, and you feel so alienated because you're the only one in the group that's just not crying. And I just wouldn't cry because I didn't understand why should I cry. I didn't feel like crying. So I understood a lot. I gained a lot of knowledge. I really did like what I learned, but I didn't feel the kind of emotion that the people around me were feeling. And at times, I could feel as if they were judging me for it. And so eventually a time came when I just did not want to attend any more dars. I would make excuses. because I did want to learn, but I didn't want to feel bad about myself. Seeing everyone cry and you're the only one who cannot even shed a tear, it makes you start to feel there's something wrong with you. It makes you start to feel as if you are misplaced. There's something wrong with your heart because the Quran is not having the effect that it seems to be having on everyone else. What we have to understand is that the Quran is not a book of magic. It's not like, words will come out of someone's mouth and everyone will instantly start to cry and be moved. It's actually a journey, and it's a journey that triggers your intellect. It's a journey that teaches you to ask important questions, to ask the right kind of questions. It's a journey that is supposed to change your perspective and your mindset so that you start to look at this world in a very, very different way. And it's a journey that teaches you how to reflect and how to ponder. It teaches you that examine your life in the past and reassess how many times in the past have you been stuck and how many times has Allah helped you. So gradually, over time, it inculcates humility and humbleness. It changes the way you think about this life, and it makes you start to fall in love with Allah. But it's a journey. It's not something that happens overnight. It's not even something that happens in a couple of weeks or in a couple of months. It's a journey in itself. Now, the problem is when I am sitting in that dars, or being a member of the young generation, when I used to be going over there and trying to learn about Islam, I was in the beginning part of the journey. So I'm still trying to understand who Allah is, and I'm still trying to connect with Him. But the other people who are sitting there, they are part of the older generation. They've already gone through that journey. They have discovered Allah. They feel Allah in their hearts. They feel that divine love. So the same words of the Quran are having a different impact on us because one group of people are advanced in their spiritual journey, and the other group of people, that includes me, we are just starting. So it's not that there's something wrong with people who don't cry. It's not that there's something wrong with people who don't get moved. They are just starting their journey. The words of the Quran are penetrating their hearts. It is entering their hearts. But in order for them to build a relationship of love with Allah, they need to first figure out who Allah is. And that in itself is going to take time. And the interesting thing is that the older generation, that gets so emotionally charged and so emotionally moved by the Quran, and they start to judge the other group of people, they forget that when they were young, the Quran did not emotionally have any impact on them either. It has an emotional impact on them now because they've spent years and years in that journey. They've gone through so many tests and hardship. They're so humbled by the fact that Allah helped them every single time. That's why they're now crying and weeping, and the Quran has such a strong impact on them. It didn't have a strong impact on them 30, 40 years ago. It only has started to have an impact on them now, but this is something they forget. So they instantly judge the other group thinking, okay, what's wrong with these kids? How come this, our young generation doesn't care about Quran? How come they don't cry? How come they don't get emotionally moved? Why is it that they are not falling in love with Allah or falling in love with the Quran in the way that we fall in love with it? So the important thing to remember is that being a journey, it's the same for everyone. Everyone has to start from scratch where they're trying to understand Allah. The words of the Quran are not going to emotionally move them much because it's not a book of magic. Okay, it's not some magical words that you will speak and then this spell will be cast upon you and then you'll start crying and weeping and loving Allah. It's a beautiful journey that Allah takes you through. It's like from Surah Fatiha till Surah Nas, Allah's holding your hand and He's taking you through this journey. And as you progress through the journey, you start to discover Allah, understand Allah, and then you start to love Allah. You have to remember we're human beings. That's how we have been created. So if you look at yourself, kind of relationships you have with the people around you, friends and cousins and so on, the only time you feel a lot of strong bonding with someone or a lot of love and trust towards someone is when you've spent years and years with them. So you've gone through all kinds of good days and bad days with them. And so now you've reached that stage where you trust them, you love them, you have a strong bond with them. As human beings, we don't love and trust someone overnight. We don't have a strong bond with someone overnight. We are in fact skeptical of people. It takes us time to start to learn to trust somebody else or have a bond with someone else. And the same is how we treat Allah, because that's how we have been created. We're humans. We need to understand Allah. We need to understand how He works. We need to understand why we were created. And then whenever we have ups and downs, moments of happiness, moments of grief and sadness, moments of tests and difficulty, we want to examine how Allah is going to react. How is Allah going to give me sukoon and contentment? How is Allah going to help me? Is He going to remove my test or not? And then over time, when we understand that, okay, Allah seems to always be there for me. He always seems to help me out. He always seems to provide sukoon and contentment to me even when I'm in a very difficult situation. I thought I would die if this test came upon me, but guess what? I survived. So over time, you start to realize this is a God I can trust. This is a God who truly, truly does love me. And that's when your bond with Allah begins. So you have to understand this is what the Quran is, not a book of magic. It's a beautiful journey, a journey of intellect, a journey of wisdom, a journey of knowledge, and a journey that alters your perspective and builds your emotions towards divine love. Now, a question that some people have is that, well, this is all correct, fine. But, when you study the surahs that were revealed in Makkah, and you study the lives of some of the companions, you realize that there were people who heard the Quran for the first time, the very first time, and they were so moved. They started crying and they instantly embraced Islam. We have cases of, for instance, Hazrat Abu Bakr. It didn't take him years and years to understand it. He instantly embraced it. We have the vanguards of Islam who in the early periods of Makkah, they were able to understand and they were moved by the Quran and they embraced it. And it happened to the extent that the chiefs of Quraysh started to call the Prophet a sorcerer or a magician, because they said, well, there's something wrong with his words. Every time he speaks the Quran, there are people who start crying and there are people who start to embrace Islam. So maybe he's a sorcerer. Now, how do we explain that? How do we explain the fact that there were some people who would instantly embrace Islam? They would instantly feel emotionally charged, even though they were hearing the words of the Quran for the first time. I mean, they didn't have to go through a journey to understand divine love. They understood it on the very first surah, the very first verse. How do we explain that? What you have to understand is that the Quran is a journey, yes, but your life is a journey as well. The only people in Makkah at that time who were so emotionally charged when they heard just one verse that they would start to cry and they would want to embrace Islam are people who were already asking the right kind of questions. They had already changed their mindset and their perspective. They were already looking at life in a very different way. They were already trying to understand the purpose of their life. They had already seen so much injustice in this world. They were wondering, what is the purpose of our existence? And where is God while all this injustice is taking place? So the Quran did not have to alter their mindset. Their mindset was already altered. They were so mature that they were already asking the right kind of questions. And so when they heard the verses of the Quran, this is exactly what they were looking for. These were the answers they were trying to search. And so instantly, when they hear those answers, that's why they would embrace Islam and they would get so emotionally charged. But then, of course, there were other people who in their journey of life, they were not asking the right kind of questions. Their perspective had not been changed. They were still pretty much in love with dunya. So for them, you see that they also embraced Islam, but it took them some time. It took them a couple of years. It's not like, the first couple of verses completely moved them emotionally. They learned a lot. They thought a lot. They did reflect, but they only embraced Islam and they started to feel the love of the divine much later. So what you understand from this overall is that the Quran is a journey, but your life is a journey as well. Where you are in your life's journey, what kind of questions you're asking, how mature your mindset is, what your perspective is, that will determine how quickly the journey of the Quran will have an impact on you. If you're someone who has experienced a lot of difficulties in life, a lot of hardship, you've seen a lot of injustice, so your life is already very difficult and you're already asking a lot of important questions, then in the journey of Quran, right near the beginning, you will feel divine love. You will feel that bond, that trust, that emotion, because that's what you were looking for. But if you're someone who's had a pretty easy going childhood, you've had a lot of fun, you've been able to satisfy all your needs and wants, a very loving family, you haven't really been exposed to much injustice or intolerance, your journey has been such that you've fallen in love with dunya so much that now the journey of Quran will eventually have the same impact on you, but it will take some more time. Because Allah has to change your entire mindset and perspective. Allah has to make you start to ask the right kind of questions. You will eventually get there. We all will eventually get to that stage where we will be able to feel that divine love in our hearts. We will weep, we will cry, we will be emotionally moved when we hear the verses of the Quran. We will feel goosebumps. Every salah, every prayer will actually alter the way that we think. Every prayer will actually make us a better version of ourselves. All of us will get there. But how quickly we get there depends on where we are in our life's journey, and that will determine how quickly the Quran's journey will affect our heart. And this is one of the reasons why when you look at the period of Makkah, in most cases, the slaves, they were the vanguards of Islam. Those who were very, very poor, who had been subjected to a lot of torture, discrimination, intolerance, injustice during the Jahiliyyah period, they were always the vanguards of Islam. In fact, not just for Muhammad, peace be upon him, in the case of all prophets, it was normally the poor who would rush towards the prophets and embrace Islam first. Because they already had, their life journey had shown them so much difficulty, they were already asking the right kind of questions. They were not in love with dunya. They could not understand the purpose of dunya, and they wanted to know the purpose of their creation. They were hoping that there is some ultimate justice later on, because this life is filled with injustice. And so because they were asking the right kind of questions, the verses of Allah would have an immediate, instant, significant impact on them. So if you are someone who is not getting emotionally moved by the Quran or by the salah that you're doing, there's nothing wrong with you. In fact, I wish someone had told me that years ago when I started my journey, so that I would not have felt so alienated, or that I would not have felt that there's something wrong with me. There's nothing wrong with you. It's a journey, you'll get there, but it will take time. So enjoy the journey that Allah is taking you through. There is hikmat, wisdom, and beauty in every step of that journey you take. May Allah grant us all wisdom. May Allah grant us the ability to connect with Him. May Allah forgive us all of our sins. And may Allah help us to spread the message of Islam. Assalamu alaikum.